The trees closed around me long before I realized I had wandered off the path. They leaned in with heavy branches and deep, slow shadows, swallowing the sky until it became little more than a pale smear high above, a ghost of light too thin to matter. I kept walking because stopping seemed worse somehow, standing still among trunks so old they had forgotten the meaning of seasons, whose bark wore scars older than memory. The forest floor softened under my steps, the ground covered in layers of damp leaves and broken twigs, the smell of earth rising thick and wet into the air, wrapping itself around my ankles like something that remembered how to cling. There were no sounds but my own movements, and even those seemed dulled, muffled by the dense weight of the night, as if the air itself had grown tired of listening. Every now and then a branch would creak overhead, or something unseen would sigh through the undergrowth. But none of it felt urgent or alive. It felt slow, inevitable, as though the forest breathed in long, shallow pulls that pulled me further inward with every step. I don't remember when the trees began to change. They grew closer, their trunks thicker, the spaces between them narrowing, until I could not stretch out my arms without brushing the rough, cold bark on either side. The air smelled older here, heavier, carrying the faint bitterness of moss and the sweet decay of fallen things. A root twisted out of the ground, thick and black like a vein, and I stepped over it without thinking, the motion smooth, automatic, as if I had done it 100 times before. In the spaces between the trees, the darkness folded itself into shapes that might have been the remains of forgotten cabins, old wells swallowed by ivy, paths that once led somewhere and now led only deeper into nothing. I walked past them without stopping, drawn by a rhythm I could not hear but could feel in my chest, a slow thudding like the pulse of something vast and dreaming far beneath the earth. There was a clearing eventually, or something like one, a place where the trees held themselves back just slightly, where the ground dipped and pooled with mist so thick it seemed almost solid. I stood at the edge of it for a long time, not because I was afraid, but because it felt wrong to break its stillness. It was not a place meant for footsteps or voices, not a place meant to be entered at all. But the forest behind me pressed close, and the forest ahead waited with the patience of stone, and so I stepped forward into the mist. It wrapped around me instantly, soft and cold, clinging to my clothes, threading through my hair, seeping into my skin. I breathed it in, and it tasted like the distant memory of rain, like the space between heartbeat and heartbeat. Shapes moved inside the clearing, slow and low to the ground, but they did not come toward me. They drifted in wide, slow arcs, circling nothing, touching nothing, content simply to be. And I understood somehow that they had been here long before I arrived, and would remain long after I was gone, spinning their slow dance in a place where time stretched thin and brittle. I crossed the clearing without hurry, my footsteps swallowed immediately by the thick moss and damp earth. At the far edge, the trees began again, though they stood further apart now, their trunks white and smooth like old bones under the faint wash of starlight. I kept walking because there was no choice, not really. The forest unfolded around me like an old memory, soft and faded at the edges, and my body remembered the way even when my mind did not. At some point, the air grew lighter, though not brighter. The mist thinned, and the ground grew firmer beneath my feet. But the trees still watched, silent and unmoving, as if weighing the shape of my shadow against the shapes of all the other shadows that had passed this way. A stream crossed my path, its water so still and dark that it seemed more like a scar in the earth than something alive. I stepped over it without pausing, feeling the cool whisper of water brush against the soles of my shoes, a brief shudder that climbed my legs and settled somewhere deep inside my ribs. On the other side, the forest grew quieter still, if that was possible. The air pressed closer. The night thickened, and I felt my own breath grow slower, softer, as if adjusting to a different kind of time. I do not know how long I walked. It might have been hours, or minutes, or the slow turning of a dream where no clocks exist. I only know that eventually the trees began to thin, not because I had reached the end, but because they had chosen to let me go. The ground sloped downward again. The sky opened up slightly, and somewhere very far away, I thought I heard the faint, broken call of a bird that had not forgotten how to mourn. I kept walking, not looking back, not marking the way. The forest would close itself behind me. The track stretched out ahead of me like the memory of a road, half sunken into the earth, the rusted rails barely clinging to their form as grass and moss swallowed them inch by inch. The air smelled faintly of metal and wet soil, a scent that felt so old it almost bypassed the nose and went straight into the hollow space behind the heart. I don't remember deciding to follow them. I only remember that my feet moved with the slow certainty of a dream, carrying me alongside the broken line that led nowhere anyone remembered. It was late, or at least the light was thin enough to press shadows into everything, washing the world in muted grays, and the soft gold of a sun that had grown too tired to fight the night. The trees on either side leaned in as if to whisper secrets to each other across the tracks, their voices hushed and trembling, their roots twisting through the cracked wooden ties as if trying to pull the whole skeleton of the railroad down into the hungry dark of the soil. I walked until the forest fell away, and there, settled into the soft curve of the earth like a shipwrecked vessel, was the train. It was longer than I expected, a slumbering beast of rust and broken windows, its surface eaten away by rain and time, its doors hanging loose or jammed shut by years of swelling and shrinking with the seasons. It did not look abandoned in anger or fear. It looked as though it had simply been forgotten, the way a childhood toy is forgotten, not suddenly but in pieces, until one day it is nothing but a shape beneath dust. I approached without hesitation, though the air around it was different, heavier somehow, pressing against my skin with the lightest touch, like fingers testing the edges of a fabric about to tear. I placed my hand against the side of the nearest car, feeling the deep chill that radiated from the metal, a cold that felt less like temperature and more like absence. The door hung open just enough to slip through, and inside the darkness was thick but not oppressive. It lay across the floor, and the seats in heavy folds, draped like the discarded clothing of someone who had vanished mid-motion. I moved through the cars slowly, my footsteps muffled by the carpet of dead leaves that the wind must have carried in, though I never once felt a breeze. The seats were torn, their stuffing spilling out like unraveling guts, and overhead the luggage racks sagged under the weight of years. In places, graffiti bloomed across the walls, colors faded into strange bruised shapes, words that meant nothing whispered out in curling letters. The further I walked, the less the train resembled anything that had once moved or carried life. It had become something else entirely, a hollowed corridor of memories left behind by those who had passed through it, and those who had never arrived. In one car, a child's shoe rested on a torn seat, small and scuffed, its laces trailing like a broken promise. Beside it, a crumpled photograph lay face down, its edges curling, the image too faded to make out, but still heavy with the sense of someone looking back. The silence grew deeper as I moved, settling into my bones, slowing my heartbeat until it felt synchronized with the slow decay around me. There was no fear, no expectation, only the slow, inevitable understanding that the train was not waiting for rescue, not hoping for repair. It had simply settled into its final form, the way fallen trees become part of the earth, the way forgotten songs become part of the air. Toward the rear of the train, the floor sloped slightly downward, and I realized the last few cars had come partially off the tracks, their wheels buried in the soft earth, their bodies sagging like weary shoulders. The final car was different. The door was closed, sealed tight against the outside world, the only door I had seen that seemed untouched by time. And though everything inside me urged stillness, a slow, sleepy voice deeper than fear coaxed my hand forward. The metal was warm beneath my fingers, pulsing gently like a creature at rest. I pushed the door open, and the air that greeted me was cooler, cleaner, laced with the faintest scent of something floral and ancient. The inside of the car was almost intact, the seats upright, the windows still carrying the faint ghost of their original shine. It was not empty. Figures sat quietly, their shapes blurred by the low light, unmoving, facing forward as though waiting patiently for a journey that would never resume. They made no sound, no acknowledgement of my presence. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, the weight of their stillness pressing into me, soaking through my skin until my heartbeat slowed to match theirs. The train sighed around me, a deep, slow exhale that stirred the dust but moved nothing else. And I understood then that there was no arrival, no destination, only the endless, gentle waiting. There was a cabin deep in the woods, so far from any trail or road that it might have grown there like the trees around it, its timbers leaning together with the same tired grace, its roof sagging under the weight of too many seasons. There was no path leading to it, no worn track or broken fence, just a thinning of the trees and the faintest impression in the earth, where footsteps might once have passed, and I do not remember deciding to approach it, only that once I saw it, my feet moved forward with a quiet inevitability. The cabin was small, barely more than a single room, its walls stitched together from uneven boards that gaped slightly at the seams, allowing slivers of mist to curl in and out like restless fingers. Its windows were clouded with grime, their glass warped and trembling under the faint touch of the breeze, and the door hung slightly ajar, rocking back and forth in a rhythm too slow to follow, as if breathing with the forest. The clearing around it was soft with moss and the slow decay of fallen leaves, the ground muffling every step until it felt as though I were floating rather than walking. And the only sound was the distant, hollow knocking of a branch against the cabin's side, a sound so faint and persistent it seemed less like a noise and more like a memory trying to surface. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long time, feeling the weight of the place press gently against my skin, not hostile but heavy, like a quilt laid over a restless sleeper. There was no sign of life, no smoke from the crumbling chimney, no footprints in the soft earth, and yet the air hummed with a slow, patient kind of waiting, the way an empty chair waits for someone who will never return. Without meaning to, I crossed the clearing and touched the door. It moved under my fingers, opening just wide enough to slip through, and the inside of the cabin was no warmer, no more welcoming than the outside. It smelled of old wood, of cold ashes, of damp cloth left too long in the rain. The floor was bare except for a scattering of debris, leaves, small stones, the brittle remains of insects long since dried and forgotten, and against the far wall stood a single chair, its back bowed, its seat worn smooth by years of weight. Beside it, a table tilted on uneven legs, bearing the remnants of objects too weathered to name, their outlines blurred by dust and time. The cabin did not seem abandoned so much as paused, caught mid-moment in a life that had been set aside and never resumed. There were no signs of violence, no marks of panic or flight, only the slow, inevitable softening of things left too long without purpose. I crossed the room without thinking, my footsteps soundless against the soft, sagging boards. In one corner, a narrow bed slumped beneath a thin, threadbare blanket, its surface undisturbed, the pillow caved inward as though still cradling the memory of a sleeping head. The window above the bed was cracked, the break spidering outward like a frozen scream. But the glass held, trapping the mist outside where it pressed hungrily against the pane, blurring the view of the forest beyond. I stood by the bed for a long time, listening to the slow creak of the cabin settling deeper into the earth, the faint rustle of the trees breathing around it, and somewhere very far away, the low, broken call of an unseen bird. There was a kind of peace in it, a slow, aching stillness that seeped into my bones and made my thoughts drift loose and weightless. I sat down on the edge of the bed, feeling the frame shift gently beneath me, the blanket releasing a faint puff of dust that shimmered briefly in the dim light before dissolving. The room darkened slowly as the sky outside deepened from gray to blue to black, the edges of the world folding inward, and I felt myself folding with it, sinking into the hush of the cabin, into the soft, formless space where time and purpose no longer mattered. I do not know how long I sat there, hours, perhaps, or only the span of a single breath drawn out until it frayed and unraveled. At some point, the mist began to seep in through the gaps in the walls, curling low along the floor, rising in slow, patient waves that lapped at my feet, my knees, my hands resting limply in my lap. It was not cold, not sharp, only thick and damp, clinging to my skin, my clothes, my hair. The walls around me faded into the mist, the chair and table swallowed in silence, and the bed beneath me sagged lower, cradling me deeper, drawing me down into the slow breathing of the earth itself. I closed my eyes, and the cabin held me, soft and indifferent, a hollow shell of wood and memory and forgetting. Outside, the forest whispered, the trees leaned closer, and somewhere, in the places where light no longer reached, the last traces of my footsteps melted into the moss. And the cabin, the lonely, breathing cabin, forgot that I had ever come. There was a house at the end of the broken road, a house so still and forgotten that even the birds overhead seemed to veer away without noticing. And though I can't remember how my feet carried me toward it, there was a sense of quiet inevitability in the way the earth sloped downward, guiding me through brittle grass and into a place that smelled faintly of dust and the sweet sharpness of rotting wood. The windows were blind, the door hung ajar as if caught mid-breath, and I paused with one hand outstretched, feeling the air between myself and that threshold shudder slightly, like something breathing out the last traces of a long sigh. I did not plan to go inside, not in any deliberate way, but my body moved forward, soft and obedient, and the moment I stepped over the threshold, The outside world seemed to dissolve behind me like paper left out in the rain. Inside the house, it was neither dark nor light, but suspended in a soft gray haze that felt like the spaces between memories. The floor creaked under my steps, but not loudly, more like a whispering acknowledgement, a tired bending of old bones. The walls leaned inward slightly, the ceiling slumped with a weary grace, and everything smelled faintly of old fabric and the deep, cool scent of soil after a long drought. I wandered without thought, brushing my fingers along the edges of abandoned chairs, broken picture frames still clinging stubbornly to the wallpaper, a child's toy left lying on its side as if the child had been called away suddenly and never returned. The house did not feel empty exactly. It felt paused, like the moment before a breath, like the moment after a dream has slipped from your mind but before you have fully awakened. I could almost hear it, the low, slow rhythm of it, the way the wind moved through the broken windows, the way the beams groaned softly in their sleep. There was no fear in me, only a deep, aching quiet, as if something inside me recognized the house in a way that had nothing to do with memory or sense. In what might once have been the living room, there was a fireplace, and on the mantel above it sat a clock without hands, its face cracked and yellowed with age, a thin line of dust drawn carefully across its surface as if marking the passage of years that had ceased to matter. Beside it, a small glass jar containing something dark and shriveled, impossible to identify but carefully placed, as though it had once been precious. I stood there for a long time, feeling the weight of those small objects settle into the spaces between my ribs, heavier than they had any right to be. Deeper inside the house, past a staircase that sagged so deeply it seemed to kneel rather than rise, I found a narrow hallway lined with closed doors, each one slightly different, some painted, some bare, some marked with deep gouges, as if something had tried once, long ago, to claw its way out. I did not touch the doors. I simply walked past them, feeling their silent hum against my skin, a kind of slow, resigned pulsing that matched the rhythm of the house itself. At the end of the hallway was a room without a door, a soft, shapeless space where the walls seemed thinner, where the outside mist drifted in and pooled along the floor like milk spilled in slow motion. In the center of that room sat a chair, perfectly upright, perfectly still, and as I stepped closer, I could see that the chair was not empty. There was something there, something slumped and shrouded, too formless to name. And though my mind recoiled, my feet carried me closer until I could almost hear it breathing, slow and shallow, the way something breathes when it has long forgotten how. I stood there until I could no longer tell whether the thing in the chair was breathing, or whether it was me, whether the house was falling inward, or whether I was. And somewhere in the spaces between those half-thoughts, I realized that I had been here before. Not in this life. Maybe not in any life. But somewhere deeper. Somewhere older. Where houses like this one waited for people like me. And not the other way around. The walls seemed to shift slightly then. Or maybe it was the mist growing thicker, and I felt the slow, inevitable tug of the house settling around me. Not malicious, not demanding, but simply folding me into its slow breathing. It's endless waiting. I sat down on the floor without really meaning to, feeling the cold creep up through the wood and into my bones. And as my eyes drifted closed, I thought I heard the clock on the mantel ticking, faintly, impossibly, counting down the minutes of a life I no longer remembered ever beginning. The house whispered around me, the mist pooled higher, and somewhere, very far away, the last echoes of the outside world faded into nothing.